Thank you. Can I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation? Thank you, Richard, and the organising committee for the invitation. And can I say how honoured I am to be on the stage with Paparangi Reid, someone who I looked up to for many years and continue to do so. Click up. So that's where I come from, which is the Gregory River, Wanya country in North Queensland. I want to talk today about our 13-year experience with working with medical schools in Australia and New Zealand in attempting to teach Indigenous health well, and what are all of the issues tied up in that, and then also looking at the implications for accreditation and college training and beyond. Also talking about what is this thing called cultural safety. In Australia there's 100 different terms which I will go through and give an overview of and give a clearer definition of it. Talk about some of the challenges for us in Indigenous health and in Australia in general in terms of racism and unconscious bias in the medical education process from students and sometimes staff and senior clinicians, but also in the health system in general, and then get to the good stuff. So we started in 2003 by writing this curriculum framework. Many of you will be aware of this. It is a project of the medical deans, or CDEMs, before changing to medical deans Australia and New Zealand. We aligned these key subject areas and outcomes with the curricula that was present in most of the medical schools at that stage, and we were cognizant of both undergraduate and postgraduate training. We included some of the key principles that would support this sort of education and assessment guidelines and how the medical school could develop this over time. We weren't looking for quick fixes, we were looking for development. Once the curriculum framework was written, we set up a professional development network, the Leaders in Indigenous Medical Education network, that could help medical schools continue this work. At the same time, the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, in collaboration with Te Ora, the Māori Medical Physicians Association, looked at all of the issues around Indigenous student recruitment and how these would align with vertical integration issues beyond primary medical education. The curriculum was endorsed in 2004 by the Deans and the AMC and included in the guidelines. We actually worked with the AMC to change the guidelines back in 05-06. In 2012, the Deans, so almost 10 years later, the Deans said, okay, how are we going? How much curriculum is being taught? What's the quality like? I just want to make the point that the Deans were very clear that we need to influence our health workforce of Indigenous people, but also for Indigenous people, meaning we weren't just concerned with getting more Indigenous students through the system, as we should do, but we're also concerned with what are all of our clinicians learning about Aboriginal health, hence the curriculum framework. The main outcome of that review is two things. On the student recruitment side, the Deans found that the rate of recruitment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students nationally now is on parity. So 3% of all medical students nationally now are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, which is a huge tick and a huge plus for the Deans and their collective work. But the rate of graduations has not matched that yet. Now there is some lag time you would expect, but that then says there's some issues going on with retention. How do medical schools retain Indigenous students or not? In the curriculum area, the main finding was that nationally there is more curriculum content being taught, but the amount of resources going into teaching that curriculum content is the same as it was in 2004 when we originally audited, meaning the same amount of people in medical schools are simply teaching more. So it tells us that medical schools nationally are not putting more resources into Indigenous health curriculum. They are teaching more, but there's no more resources going in nationally. And secondly, it tells us that we have no guarantees of the quality of that curricula. So they're two very important outcomes. Based on that review, then I did my FUD to have a look and analyse this and try and decide or try and tease out what were the issues within medical schools. These are three very brief case studies that I will skim over. I'm happy to provide further detail after if you are interested. In one of the medical schools I worked in closely, not directly employed there, but worked with, the Deputy Dean of Teaching and Learning came up to me at a conference and said, do you mind if I have a 5-minute chat with you at morning tea? And I said, sure. And when I talked with this deputy dean, they said, listen, the AMC's coming again, and we really need to give a report about Indigenous health. And we've done some things, and we've employed, a 0.6 person, but we're really not sure where to next. Can you help us write a report? And I said, well, that's bullshit, right? But yes, okay, on this occasion I'll sit down with you and write. What's your strategic vision in Aboriginal health? What's your curriculum plan? But for this occasion, yes, I'll sit down and talk with you about that. And lo and behold, 3 years later, that same person came back to me and said the same thing. Do you mind if we have a 5-minute chat? The AMC is coming for review. Now, that says to us that some medical schools, now look, by and large, nationally, the deans and medical schools in Australia and New Zealand are to be congratulated for their development in the 10 years. So it's not all bad. There's been a lot of good work go in. But there are some remaining issues and challenges which really go to the core of what we're talking about in cultural safety and diversity. What this says to us is that Indigenous health is an add-on or a bolt-on. It's not a strategic mission or strategy for the medical school as an organisation. It says that we're quite happy to leave it with 2 or 3 champions and that it be their responsibility. It doesn't say that the head of research, for example, or the head of teaching and learning has clear targets within their operational and strategic plans for improving Indigenous health outcomes. The second case study was of a nursing school within a faculty that I'd had something to do with. But similar issues with other professions. I'm happy to talk about psychology, social work, and the others that I'm working with in psychology. But in this particular nursing school, there was a discrete Indigenous health subject which had bad student reviews and ratings. So after 3 or 4 years, the head of school had repeatedly tried to get rid of the course because he said, look, there's bad student ratings on this course. We need to just get rid of it. But they didn't talk to their associate professor of Aboriginal health within the faculty, for example. They didn't talk to their dean. They didn't really talk to anybody. They just said, we're going to get rid of this because of the student reviews. Now, the evidence would suggest otherwise. The University of Western Australia, Helen Milroy and her associates, tracked student outcome measures of Indigenous health teaching over their 6-year undergraduate program. They found that regardless of the content of what was taught and regardless of who taught it, the standard student reaction in first-year medicine was, why do we have to learn this rubbish? Pretty much. By third year, the standard reaction was, oh, yeah, I kind of see what you mean. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And by 5th and 6th year clinical training years, students' standard response was, thank God we learnt all of that. So this tells us that student recruitment to something that is uncomfortable for them, reviews of something that is uncomfortable for them, shouldn't be our only measure of the worth of curricula. Firstly, it secondly tells us that the learning journey is a transformational one, that it takes time, and that you can't expect people to get it in first or second year even. And thirdly, it tells us about responsibility. Who makes decisions for Aboriginal health within a medical school? Can the head of nursing or medicine just routinely say, nah, not important to us, we're getting rid of that course. We're going to integrate Aboriginal health with cultural safety because we need to be culturally safe for all different cultures. Does that sound familiar? What that's saying is Indigenous health is too special, and why are they so special? We just need to teach culture for everybody. And I'll tease the issue out in that. And secondly, and thirdly, briefly, there was a rural clinical school head who, after a few years, there's one Aboriginal worker in that unit, a registered nurse, who was routinely not included or invited to academic staff meetings, but only seen as the cultural liaison officer. And that, after 3 or 4 years, that Aboriginal registered nurse finally got the head of the clinical school to agree to do a morning tea for NAIDOC Week, National Aborigines Week, in the rural clinical school. And they invited a local elder to come in and talk, and the local elder spoke about the history of massacres and genocide in the local area as a preview to saying to students, so you're going to see the outcomes of these health issues with the patients you're dealing with. And the rural clinical school said, get that woman out of my clinical school. I want to talk about positive things and move forward. Now, these are, of course, you might think isolated incidents, but they are actually a pattern of the level. It represents the level of understanding within our medical schools about what Aboriginal health is and how we can do this well. So what were the findings? What it says is that it has a lot to do with the hidden curriculum. Basically, one of the more candid deans when I started this process 13 years ago said, listen, the only thing that's going to make medical schools jump is accreditation and money. And we sort of have dealt with the accreditation stuff, but the money issue is still the issue. Is it a strategic enough priority for the medical school to invest in? The evidence at the moment would suggest that it's not. Staff capacity. Was there transformational unlearning? What Courtney Ryder and her colleagues at Flinders University found is that before you can teach Indigenous health well, look, in Australia, we don't have Aboriginal studies in primary to P to 12 training. We still do not have a national curricula for Aboriginal studies. It's highly controversial. In some states and in some pockets, there is some good learning. So is it any surprise that our first-year medical students, and indeed our medical educators and professionals, don't know anything about Aboriginal people? That we feel uncomfortable about teaching this stuff. Is it any surprise? The National Reconciliation Barometer found that Aboriginal, I think it's roughly 80% of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal respondents said, we don't know who the other side is. Isn't that a huge social issue? In Australia, 80% of respondents, non-Aboriginal respondents, said we don't know enough about Aboriginal people, and conversely, a similar number of Aboriginal people said we don't know enough about the way white Australians tick and what they think of us. So, what we're dealing with here is a deficit of national concern. So we need to take our first-year medical students and start from day one. And we need to be trained far more clear about how we're doing that. But before you can teach Aboriginal health well, you have to transformationally unlearn all the racism that's in the media and all of the unconscious bias, if you will, if that term's more comfortable. And that's the bit that's missing in medical school curricula. We're thinking that Indigenous health curricula is jumping in and measuring blood sugar levels or running out to run diabetes clinics or just giving some Aboriginal students some more scholarships. Now, those things are important, but by no means are they actually transformational unlearning. And we have to do that with the staff first. We staff need to learn how to do this well. It says that there's no more resources going in, as I talked about. It says that the motivations and values of medical schools often are, and I mean, this is no indictment on deans or heads of hospitals even, or heads of health departments, heads of colleges. One can understand all of the pressures in ever-increasing responsibilities and ever-decreasing budgets in the Australian public health system to effect transformational change. However, Indigenous health can't be treated as an add-on to that. It's essentially got to be a core part of clinical practice and clinical safety. And so the motivations and values were not quite clear. People thought it was just simply the health of another group of people in the country. And very much, as Paparangi foreshadowed, there are confused definitions of Aboriginal health and cultural safety. So what's the evidence on the amount of racism and the after effects of colonisation in Australia? It's emerging in Australia. What we can say from overseas is that we can measure very clearly the health effects biologically of racism. We can measure in Australia the psychosocial impacts. Fiona Stanley and Stephen Zubrick and others measured very clearly in the West Australian Aboriginal Child Health Study the intergenerational impacts of child removal on current generation's mental health and well-being. So it's kind of anathema to the evidence to say it's in the past, get over it, when we can see the very real health outcomes today. And of course the very important structural effects of racism and colonisation in terms of access to services. So there's a plethora of evidence, which I won't go into in detail, from the education, the amount of racism in the public, that study by Steve Larkins was racism in the federal public service. In health, there is excellent evidence from Bridget Robson and Kame and others and Paparangi in New Zealand about if you control for all other variables, that the only thing that separates differential treatment and differential access to certain operations and treatments is being Māori or not. So there's actually no argument to say, but they were isolated incidents. This is a real public health issue for all of us. Now in Australia, what we know is that 32% of Aboriginal respondents only a couple of years ago report racial discrimination in medical settings most or all of the time. And there is some more detailed work going on now to actually being able to separate the data against other variables. So it's emerging in Australia, but I wouldn't suspect it's going to be any different to the US and New Zealand and Canada. And of course in sports, the Adam Goods thing, shall I say no more. We like Aboriginal culture if it's exotic and nice, and we like art on our walls, but we don't dare like it if you express your culture as an expression of pride or self-determination. That's too scary for us, and we will hound you down. So one of the things about this is that it's difficult to talk about racism. It is a difficult concept. It's uncomfortable for many of us. Now, that term, white fragility, is a term in the literature. It's not talking about white people per se. It's talking about the whiteness values that are implicit in our public health planning and how we get very fragile when we're confronted with something that makes us uncomfortable. And I'm reminded of the conversation this morning, in fact, about bullying. I think there's a really good parallel here, that it is uncomfortable. There is going to be grief and stress and shock and denial reactions and anger when we talk about it. But if we don't name it and deal with it and get sophisticated about how to respond, then how are we going to respond? So it's simply to say that we need to get more sophisticated about our skills in understanding, quantifying, understanding and responding to. So what is cultural safety? Essentially, cultural awareness is a lesser version. I teach you about me. So it's kind of othering, it's learning about the other or the exotic. And cultural safety is more about learning about oneself and your own cultural values and how they might impact on any different group that you come into contact with. So in simple terms, when you go to Italy or Argentina, I presume you not only learn about their language, food, culture, history, but while you're doing it, subconsciously or consciously, you're also learning about yourself, because you're constantly engaging with and saying that's different to or similar to the way we do it at home. So when you travel, as Marco Polo said, you learn more about yourself than about the new lands that you might visit. But the term itself came from Irahapati Ramsden and others in nursing in New Zealand, the Māori nurses, where one of the patients in a clinical safety audit said, "You're all carrying on about clinical safety and quality of training. What about cultural safety? What about my needs as a Māori person?" Now, this is developed in New Zealand to have a bit of a hierarchy of learning where cultural awareness is the base knowledge, so you're aware of differences as an individual. Sensitivity is where you're sensitive to differences and might slightly change your course of action. But cultural safety is both individual and institutional change. So it's about not just, if we could train magically every single person in the health workforce in Australia to understand cultural safety and Indigenous health perfectly, if we could do that, that's still not going to make the health system culturally safe. Because the system is set up on a set of presumptions, policies, funding models and decision-making processes that privilege certain people over others. So cultural safety is referring to both of those, both individual and institutional. In Australia, what we talk about is a plethora of different terms: appropriate, reflexive, capable, proficient. We kind of come up with a couple of different terms every year. Collectively, what they're referring to is individual knowledge, skills and attitudes, or individual competencies of the individual clinician or worker or educator. Cultural safety, or as it's sometimes in Australia called respect or security, refers to both individual and institutional. We've made a mistake in Australia in the last 20 years in thinking that if we teach our culture to non-Aboriginal people, that they will magically love us and magically treat us better in the clinical situation. And that's 10 steps too far. What we need to teach non-Aboriginal people, I won't go into all of that detail there, but it's kind of a theoretical deconstruction of that idea. Basically what it does is it keeps Aboriginal people as the problem that if they just comply more, if they just turn up to school more, they'll get through their Maori and Indigenous Aboriginal training. If they just get more scholarships, then it'll all be okay. That's half of the issue. That is important, but it's half of the issue. What we need to look at, as Paparangi said, is the system as well. What we're really doing in Australia when we talk about Aboriginal health is trying to fit Aboriginal people into a white health system. We haven't decolonised the way that the system thinks, plans or delivers services. We haven't dealt with the power issue. We haven't dealt with the racism issue. We haven't dealt with the decision and governance and management issues. We've attempted to. We're getting there, but we're not so far along as we could be. Essentially, when we talk about the Aboriginal problem in Australia, now this is broader than just health. This is a bit of a socio-cultural analysis, or socio-political perhaps. How you define the problem, of course, is how you define the solution. So if you define the problem as Aboriginal compliance or as Aboriginal individual capacity, then you'll get a certain set of outcomes, meaning you'll respond to that with more scholarships and some patient transport and some interpreters. Now, those things are important, but is that going to fix the problem? Because the focus of change is still on the Aboriginal individual or family. What we're not looking at is the institutional precursors. Really, we need to be doing both. This is the model of applied cultural safety I've come up with in Australia. Basically, I don't know if this pointer works. Is there a buzzer? Anyway, I'll point with my fingers. Now, we confuse these two concepts. I'm going to talk crudely for a second, so forgive me. Does that? I should just try. Yeah, it does work. Thank you. So on the left, forgive me for those on that side of the room, Aboriginal health. Does it reach that far? That's the business of delivering services to Aboriginal people and should be led by Aboriginal people where possible. If there's not Aboriginal trained people in the vicinity, then you should have advisory bodies and co-partners with Aboriginal organisations that can help you deliver that service. But we confuse the two as if they're the same thing. That head of the nursing school was confusing Aboriginal health with cultural safety. She was saying, inadvertently, we don't need to have a special focus on Aboriginal people. Why do they get all the attention? We've got other cultures that we need to worry about. And so we can simply just teach Aboriginal health as a part of cultural competence for everybody. Now, the problem with that is that if, I'll paraphrase the New Zealand experience, and please tell me if I'm sure you will if I get this wrong. Basically, when the Māori nurses started out talking about cultural safety, they were actually doing both. They were trying to do Māori health and cultural safety as well, reforming the whole system. So after about 10 years of that, and cultural safety being written into the national public health legislation based on the Treaty of Waitangi, after about 10 years, there started to be pushback from the national public health system where health planners said, we do cultural competence for everyone. We've got a large Pacific Island community here. Why should we worry about Māori? Why are they so special? And the Māori leaders at the time were forced to reconsider their definitions and to clarify. Actually, they were pretty clear. But to say, listen, this stuff, cultural safety is about levelling the playing field and making sure your system's not racist, in short. Cultural safety is really a euphemism for racism and colonisation. And then leave Aboriginal health stuff to us. And we'll ask for your help, and we will need your help to do that. But what happens in Australia is we mash the two together. Now, this goes beyond health as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit crudely now to explain what happens. In Australia, basically, Aboriginal people spend all our time trying to tell white people what to do. You need to understand us better, you need to change your policies, you need to get educated, you need to stop being so racist, you need to do this, blah, 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 right? We spend all our energy on trying to change white fellas. And bless their hearts, white fellas spend all their time trying to change us. You need to think like us, dress like us, come to school like us, have the same values of us, and then we'll give you some scholarships and you'll get through and you'll be a good clinician. Now, that's a waste of energy. What I want is non-Aboriginal health professionals to spend their time doing this stuff, taking responsibility for cultural safety. I give you permission, not teach culture. I'm not asking you to teach Aboriginal culture. I'm asking you to teach cultural safety from an Aboriginal perspective with Aboriginal people. That's your responsibility. Racism in Australia is not an Aboriginal responsibility. It's not Adam Goods' responsibility. It's the AFL's. Right? On the other hand, what Aboriginal people could do well to do is spend more of our time teaching culture to our own and effecting more change in that way. Now, they're both important and there is going to be crossover. What they both rely on is this very important thing in the middle called Indigenous knowledge or place. It's all about the context. I'm from Queensland, but I live in Victoria. I can't do Aboriginal health in Victoria if I don't acknowledge place. Whose country is it? What is the context? What is the historical, social, political situation that's gone on there that influences health today? I need to know that and defer to the local traditional owners. On the other hand, we can't actually be culturally safe in Melbourne for, let's say, African immigrants in Dandenong unless we're acknowledging that it's Aboriginal land. Because those African immigrants want to know whose country it is. And if you understand local Aboriginal land, then you're going to, cultural safety from an Aboriginal perspective, then you're going to understand how to be culturally safe for all other cultures. Whereas what we do in Australia is we try to choose between one and the other. We try to pit Aboriginal health against multicultural health. And that's because our definitions are very confused. I'll give you a parallel example with the AFL while we're talking about that. About 10 years ago, when they tried to work out how to stop the rising number of rapes and sexual assaults by AFL players that were making their way into the media, they decided, right, we better do something about women's participation. Let's employ one woman in the organisation. And her role will not only be to get more women into the sport and on boards and to participate, but to educate all of the blokes in the organisation about their sexism. But that wasn't in her job description. It just simply was that she couldn't do women's participation without that extra work. Right? But the AFL weren't going to do that. They didn't want to buy into a sexism discussion. We just want you to look after the women over there. We don't want to change ourselves. So do you see the parallel for Aboriginal health workers in a hospital, for example? 2 Aboriginal health workers in a major tertiary hospital. Everything Aboriginal lands on their desk, and yet when funding and other decisions are to be made, there's no buy-in, no input, nobody seeks their opinion then. So the issue is, to use that very simple example, Aboriginal health workers in that hospital can lead and direct how the business of Aboriginal health could be done better in collaboration with community partners. And the hospital hierarchy have to take responsibility for dealing with the racism in the health system, even if you don't know that it's there. Your first task is to quantify it. Like Kate gave us an example this morning about bullying in the hospital, and the Royal College of Surgeons have undertaken now, the first task is to quantify it, admit it, it's painful, there's going to be angry reactions, but deal with it. Get a strategy, put some resources in, think about who else you need to be in the room and do something about it. That's the bit that's not happening in Australia. That's the bit, my friends, that you are the leaders of. I give you permission today to have a go and make mistakes about dealing with racism in the health system, because people like me are sick of dealing with it. That's your job, and we will support you in that. 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, I'll skip.
A lot of people don't.
Okay. The last point I will make, if we get time, we'll come to that video. It's very good. Paparangi's already foreshadowed this. The last point I will make is that equality is not equity. And I will just simply say, I got a quote. I'm embarrassed to admit the source for this one. It's not very academic. It's Facebook. But it was very good. Not this picture, but this quote I'm going to read. When you're used to being privileged, equity feels like oppression. Yeah? When blokes in the AFL are used to being privileged and don't even know they're privileged, and all of a sudden there's a task, process to try and get more women on boards, the blokes on the board say, "Oh, why are you taking positions from us for? This is a merit-based system." right? We're talking about the myth of the meritocracy. There is no such thing. We're talking about a myth of a meritocracy. And like Paparangi has said, we need elevators to make it actually equal. That's not oppression for the privileged. That's equity. But it is going to feel uncomfortable at first. So basically what we're doing in our medical schools, our hospitals, our health departments and our colleges is we're doing Aboriginal inclusion, which is, if you will, an intermediate organisational approach to Aboriginal health, meaning we have an Aboriginal advisory committee, we might do a sausage sizzle during NAIDOC week, we might have 1.5 Aboriginal employees, and we might have a reconciliation action plan. Now they're all very important, but that's an intermediate level of development of an organisation. I think I've said that. What we're not doing is social justice. So when the AFL is challenged about racism with the Adam Goodes incident, it responded in a very telling way. It was Indigenous round. There were Indigenous artwork on all of the players. There were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags everywhere to be seen. And when an Aboriginal player demonstrates pride and self-determination, and after the backlash, the AFL said, oh, poor Adam, he's got mental health issues. Do you see? They turned it back into an individual issue. They didn't say, hold on a minute, we're the AFL, we have to deal with racism. Why? Because they were concerned about ticket sales, people, money. So what values and motivations are we doing Aboriginal health on? Are we doing inclusion, which is nice, but it's not going to get you to close the gap? Or are we doing it on decidedly social justice measures? Because we don't want Aboriginal clinicians, for example, to be advisory to our college anymore or to our medical school. We want Aboriginal clinicians to be on our boards and councils. We want to share power with them. That's transformation. In Australia, we do reconciliation, we don't do treaty. So again, reconciliation is nice. It's Fascination Australia. You know, it's about the other. And it's good, it's feel good, but it's not dealing with the central issues of power. Who makes the decisions? Where is the governance coming from? On whose terms are decisions being made? And we essentially do medicine as charity. As Paul Farmer has talked about, there are different levels of dealing with medicine, and if we do medicine as an epidemiological cohort model only, what we end up doing is doing charity. We help the other, the poor, less powerful other. And what we ought to be doing as professions is moving towards a social justice model where our specific goal is to work with the underserved to help them liberate themselves. And that ought to be our specific goal, and take responsibility for our part in systemic change. So I've kind of foreshadowed most of these. Strengths-based interventions, not deficit. We don't want the Aborigines are mad, bad or sad narrative anymore. Thank you, Paparangi. That's her excellent summary of that. Meaning the statistics don't mean that all Aboriginal people are mad, bad and sad. Statistics are bad, but it's just actually representative of a systemic and individual set of issues. Indigenous knowledges because of place, Indigenous worldviews and values and motivations. Specifically, as a profession, I'm asking you to take responsibility for and measure transformational unlearning of racism and unconscious bias amongst your profession in the same way that you're now addressing it with bullying. I'm asking you to think about how you can share power and resources with Aboriginal people in this space. And I'm asking you that very important question that the medical experience shows us hasn't been answered yet. How do you develop quality over time? How do we move from inclusion, reconciliation, niceness to actually getting the outcomes that we're all looking for? Thanks. Maybe after questions.